Okay. All right, so here we go again. One more talk and then we'll break for lunch. So as we just heard, very on par topic here right before lunch, looking at diet and nutrition and brain health in folks with younger onset Alzheimer's family. So very, very excited to welcome to the podium here my colleague, Dr. Angela Hanson, who is a geriatrician at the Memory and Brain Wellness Center and does research specific to this topic of diet and nutrition. So let's welcome Dr. Hanson. This, that'll make your slides before. Nice.
Works. All right, well, thank you for having me. And let me know if there's any audio problems here or on the Zoom. I'm usually pretty loud, so again, thank you. So I'll be talking to you about, again, diet and nutrition for a healthy brain, what we should and should be not be eating, and how we know. Oh, and I'm gonna get my phone out because I lose track of time. So I will be giving you a brief overview of the evidence. So how do we know what we should be eating for dementia prevention? Some of this evidence comes from what I call late onset Alzheimer's, and some of it comes from what I would call early onset or genetic Alzheimer's in animal studies. I will compare and contrast different types of diets throughout the world. And I'll take a stab at some diet recommendations for different stages of dementia, and then hopefully have a lot of time for questions. So I tried to prepare a few slides and have time for questions, and then lunch. So I don't know if this figure is familiar to anyone in the room. This was pretty popular in 2017. The Lancet, which is a medical journal, published in 2017, these are ways to prevent Alzheimer's in the general population. And we're usually talking about, the late onset Alzheimer's disease. If you don't have a risk gene that, definitely causes Alzheimer's, like Dr. Jada was talking about, ways to prevent Alzheimer's. I don't know if anyone has seen this kind of squiggly picture before, but what they did is they studied very carefully a bunch of epidemiology. So following people over time and knowing all the things they did and didn't do. And then from that, calculating risk factors and preventative factors for developing Alzheimer's. And they came up with 9 potentially modifiable risk factors for dementia. And then in 2020, they added 3 more. So now there's 12. So there's 12 risk factors. And if you flip them upside down, they're preventative factors for dementia. And I break them up here into early risk factors, midlife risk factors. And I get this question a lot as a geriatrician, what's midlife? And I never really know. But Lancet defined it as age 45 to 65. So hooray, we know now that's the midlife. And then late life, age 65 and older. And so these are things that we can do both personally and then as a societal level to think about, hey, if we want to prevent dementia, this is where we should put our resources and efforts. So early risk factors, low education. So we're talking about kiddos. Getting kiddos in school and making sure they do their reading, writing, arithmetic, all of that stuff. So the COVID epidemic and, thinking about that is kind of scary, like, how kids got behind. But low education. And then, of course, if you go to school forever, it is protective. And, because not perfectly protective. I certainly see people in my memory clinic that have PhDs and law degrees and stuff that, still unfortunately have this illness. But as a population protection, it's thought that if you learn foreign languages, if you go to school, in general, you are protected both from dementia and then you get it later in life too. Midlife risk factors. So hearing loss, not just that you can't hear until you don't remember, but that there might be something to losing those neurons for hearing, traumatic brain injury, high blood pressure, drinking too much alcohol, obesity, and high BMI. And then later life risk factors. Some people say that later life risk factors are actually signs of early dementia and maybe not actually risk factors. So if you go to conferences, people argue about this politely. But smoking, so like depression, if you have early onset depression, maybe that's a sign of early dementia. But I think there's some evidence that, at least acting on these might, treat or stave off some of the later stages of Alzheimer's. So smoking, depression, social isolation. So thinking about COVID again. Physical inactivity. We heard about exercise and how it can, even if you have a gene that may cause Alzheimer's, if you exercise, you might stave off that age of onset. So diabetes, and then air pollution. This was one that got added to the 2020. I don't remember what all of the three that were added, but that was one. So what ones are related to diet? I thought maybe so they don't say bad diet on here, but I think diet is embedded in a few of these. So certain kinds of diets, like high salt, high fat diet, can increase your blood pressure. Alcohol, of course, is a part of your diet. A little bit of moderation of alcohol may be good for you, but too much alcohol may be bad. If you have a lot of fat in your diet, or your diet can certainly lead to obesity. And then diabetes. And then I put social isolation here because when I think about diet, I think about routines, I think about social eating, and social isolation. You may be eating by yourself, but you're not eating with a community. I think about that a lot. And so I bolded that one to think about. So as a society, if we want to build a society to protect against dementia, I think, eating communally, having fresh fruits and vegetables, like, thinking about like our aunts, like, are you eating enough? Like, well, we may be eating enough, but, are you getting good nutrition? So the aunt throwing away all your expired food in that commercial. We need a community to help care for us, to make sure we're eating okay. Probably don't need that extra piece of cake. Yeah, Aunt Bonnie. So these, I put in there references, and so if you want to read about more of these things, they are a little more sciencey, except for the book. And I think there's a copy of this book here in this building if you want to check it out and look at it. We'll go through it. Okay, so I talked a little bit about, so that's sort of like a big, broad overview of how do we prevent dementia overall and epidemiology. Let's zero in a little bit more on diet studies. So a lot of people study this in animal models. So animal models of Alzheimer's disease do tend to focus on the genetic Alzheimer's cause. So they knock in the human genes, and these mice develop amyloid and tau. I missed Dr. Jayadev's first few slides. I don't know if she touched on some of this, but the animal models of Alzheimer's tend to mimic the genetic or early onset Alzheimer's disease more accurately. And a lot of these experiments that show that high fat, high sugar diet is bad for the brain have been done in mouse models. So there's kind of there's two types of evidence. A lot of the epidemiology studies that show that diets high in saturated fat are bad for us kind of come from the late onset Alzheimer's, just because that's where most of the Alzheimer's is. I think Dr. Jayadev talked about that, but the animal models confirm that it's also true in young onset. So pretty much anyone that has an Alzheimer's pathology, it seems that there's truths for all of the group. The truths hold for everyone in a similar way. And what are those truths? That diets high in saturated fat do increase levels of brain amyloid and tau. They increase brain inflammation, and they can decrease memory, both in human experiments and in mouse experiments. And then if you add on simple refined sugars to that high saturated fat diet, then that even worsens those findings. So, so kind of like the super size me diet. So the high fat diet plus a Coke, sugar, simple sugar and high fat. And here's a picture of, and we could spend the full 45 minutes just talking about all the mechanisms. There's probably multiple mechanisms and we're still trying to figure out why. This is one possible mechanism, is that saturated fat, as you ingest it in the small intestine, binds to these big giant globs of fat called chylomicrons. They get taken up by the liver, and amyloid beta or A beta actually is produced and binds in our small intestine, and then it gets transported into the brain and can form amyloid. This has been shown in a bunch of different animal models now. So you can actually get more A beta in your brain by eating saturated fat diets, which is kind of just crazy to think about. We think of amyloid in the brain being produced in the brain and staying in the brain, but you can actually produce it in the diet and it can transport it to the brain. So this is one mechanism potentially why a saturated fat diet could increase amyloid, and why cutting saturated fat out could potentially help clear amyloid if you're not eating it. So Dr. Jayadav talked a lot about some of the genes. Has anyone here heard of ApoE gene or 23andMe? So ApoE, so Dr. Jayadav talked about, I think, deterministic genes that were way up here on the graph, right? If you have one of those genes, it's very likely you're going to get the disease. Grandma had it, mom had it, you're likely going to have it. The age might vary. And then there's all these genes way down on the bottom where they kind of increase your risk, kind of like diabetes and cancer genes. ApoE is kind of weird. It's in the middle. It's not a deterministic gene, but it's a pretty high risk, non-deterministic gene. And so if you have one copy, your risk of Alzheimer's is a little like 3 to 4-fold. If you have 2 copies, it's about 15-fold. So it is a higher risk than the average, risk gene, but it's still not deterministic. So that's why I say it's weird. So it's one of those genes that we're all kind of, when you're studying Alzheimer's and you're studying a drug, you have to incorporate ApoE. You don't necessarily have to look at all the genes that are known to man, but you have to look at ApoE because it's just one that sort of sticks out. It's a risk factor that sticks out. Anyway, I study this gene in my research, and it turns out that it may affect. It may be different. It may be that personalized medicine down the road will dictate that if you're male versus female or ApoE4 carrier or not, there might be slightly different supplements or diets that are recommended for you. Right now, the party line is that everyone's kind of giving the same recommendation. I would say that one thing that we know true is the ApoE4 carriers seem to be more susceptible to alcohol. And in my research, I'm studying the theory that ApoE4 carriers don't seem to be as harmed by a higher fat diet than those that are not E4 carriers. So I'm studying that in my lab. So we don't know what that means or how to recommend that to patients yet because it's such an early finding, but it's definitely something that we're actively studying. This Dr. Isaacson, Richard Isaacson, and his paper is one of the papers I gave you earlier in the references. He said, individualized dietary recommendations hold promise for optimizing brain health and are generally considered safe. So what his approach is, this is the paper here. And we're going to talk about diets in a minute. If you're thinking about going on a brand new diet or radically changing your diet, one of the things that he recommends is working closely with a nutritionist or your doctor to look at your labs and things and don't try to guess like what's best for you just based on, what might be good, get some basic labs. Look at your lipids, your glucose, inflammation. You can see before and after, and is the diet actually, lowering your lipids and doing the things you want it to do. So that's something that he recommends. And so that he wrote a couple of nice papers about that. But this is all still kind of new science. Like I said, we don't yet have the individualized approach that I think we will in 10 years, 5 to 10 years. But what do we know? What should we be eating? There are, of course, right? This makes sense. And look at the world, how many people are on the world and all the different kinds of diets there are on this earth. There are almost assuredly different types of diets that are healthy. And when you think about what you need to eat if you live in Nome, Alaska versus if you live on the equator, that's probably very different. Or if you're preparing for a marathon, or if you're pregnant, or if you're older, So I don't think we're going to have like the one diet that's the only diet. But there's going to be some truisms across the globe. And I think, this is something to be really careful of, is that no one food or supplement will cure or prevent a complicated disease. People have been looking for that and selling this since we can sell stuff, but it's not going to be true. And then I think this is really important. If you're trying to lose weight to fit into a dress or a suit for a wedding, any diet probably will work for a minute. But if you're trying to make real life-sustaining changes, that you're going to stick with, you have to pick a diet you can live with. So I give the example of my mom, and I got her permission. I got her to sign a HIPAA waiver. I'm going to talk about her. She has a sweet tooth. She is the dessert first person at the restaurant. She's just not going to cut out all sweets from her diet. She's just not. So she has, if she's going to, come up with a diet that's going to work for her, it's going to have to incorporate some sugar in it. So maybe some, sugar substitutes that taste sweet or that kind of thing. She's not going to go on a broccoli only diet. That's just not going to be my mother. Whereas me, I'm more of a savory person. I like potato chips and dip. I mentioned that earlier. I like Super Bowl parties. Love the food at Super Bowl parties, unfortunately. So, I like that salt. So, salt substitutes, flavors, Asian food, love, because there's lots of flavors in it. So you have to pick something that you can live with, I think. And then if you're caring for someone that has dementia, and we'll get into that a little bit, but something that they can live with, radically changing someone's diet that's not, conducive to what tastes good to them in the long run, I think is just setting yourself up to have a lot of battles. So just thinking about raising your kids, I did not eat my vegetables when I was a kid, and no, I don't want. So, pick those battles. So pick a diet you can live with, and of course you have to incorporate if you have diabetes and that kind of thing. And then we're going to talk about this at the end, but tailoring the recommendations to what your goals are for that diet. Are we talking about preventing disease in a healthy older adult, or very early stages of a memory loss disorder, where you want to do everything you can to stave off the tau and the amyloid? Or are we talking about someone that's more in the later stages and comfort is more of a goal? So I think really keeping those things in mind, and we'll get into that in one of the slides. All right, so who here has heard of the Mediterranean diet, or even the MIND diet? So I see some hands. So the Mediterranean diet, and here's what I would say is the best studied diet among scientists that study diet. And there's a book in the back, Diet for the Mind, that you can look at. So people who tend to follow the Mediterranean diet have healthier white matter structure. They tend to do better on memory tests, have larger hippocampal volumes, decreased amyloid on a brain scan. So here's that white matter. Here's low white matter, these white spots. And here's higher white matter, these white spots. So the white matter are the cords or the axons that connect different parts of the brain together. So eating a Mediterranean diet, you have healthier white matter in your brain. And you have less hippocampal atrophy or shrinkage. So hippocampus, really important for learning and memory. It's the part of the brain that can atrophy or shrink early in Alzheimer's. Not just Alzheimer's, but certainly Alzheimer's and hippocampal atrophy go together. It's called hippocampus because that's Latin for seahorse. It looks like a seahorse according to some people. I think I have a picture of it. So this is a healthy brain, a coronal section, so looking straight at someone. Here's the ears, so deep in around here. So a nice hippocampus here, and then in Alzheimer's, this is a smaller, shrunken down. All right, so Rush University in Chicago. So Dr. Martha Claire Morris, who wrote that book, she did pass away a couple years ago from cancer, unfortunately, but she left a legacy and lots of people are still studying this. What they tried to do is, I don't know if anyone here has seen, oh, now I can't remember the name of the movie. I shouldn't improvise my talks, but Robin Williams and he's teaching poetry, the very beginning of that movie. Dead Poets Society. They're trying to like analyze a poem line by line at the beginning. I mean, poetry, just let it go. It's poetry. But what they try to do is analyze the diet line by line. Like, okay, what is it about the mind diet? Is it the falafel? Is it this and that? But in this, it's a good thing to do because what they did is they scientifically dissected the Mediterranean diet and said, this is the parts of the Mediterranean diet, distill it down, and this is what is good about it, and you should eat this. And so they emphasize 10 healthy food groups: chicken, fish, leafy green vegetables, other vegetables, berries, nuts, olive oil, wine, beans, and whole grains. Avoid foods like cheese, butter, and margarine, pastries and sugary foods, red meat, and fried foods. So that's the picture of the book again. They've done lots of surveys and studies and even some experimental studies, like putting people, it's hard to randomize people to diets for very long. Those are very expensive and hard to do studies, but people that follow this kind of diet tend to get less Alzheimer's, okay? This is just that same slide again, like what are the 10 foods for brain health? And then this is just a few more details, some other studies. So there was a very small study that people who drank blueberry juice for 12 weeks showed improvements in their memory. Fish, I just wanted to spend a couple of seconds on. There's a lot of debate about whether fish includes shellfish or not. And some studies do say that some studies do include shrimp, lobster, and crab as fish that is healthy, and then some don't. And I think one thing to keep in mind here is it's probably, speaking of the Super Bowl, if you're eating fish, even if it's shrimp, even if it's lobster dipped in a little butter, what you're doing is intercepting that ball for a touchdown and taking the points away from the other team being red meat. Because you're probably not, you have to eat something, right? If you're eating shellfish or fish, you're probably not eating red meat. So, because you can only eat so much food in one sitting. So I think that's the fun thing and the difficult thing about studying diet is you always have to eat something. And if you're eating one thing, you're not eating another thing. Whereas a drug, you can actually compare it to placebo. Whereas diet, you're always kind of you have to eat something. So anyway, that's what I think about a fish and shellfish is, it may be that, fatty or actual fish is probably healthier than like lobster dipped in butter, plus lobster dipped in butter is expensive, but lobster is probably, and shrimp is probably still healthier than red meat. And then there's some study for mixed nuts and curry that it is healthy for the brain as well. Leafy greens and flavonols, lots of studies about this. People who ate at least 9 servings a week of leafy greens scored better on cognitive tests. So spinach, lettuce, salad, kale, collards, and greens. And it seems like it's the flavonols when they dissect it down and try to figure out the exact things that are healthy. Also found in beans, apples, blueberries, olive oil, tea, and tomato sauce. I apologize for this slide being kind of hard to read on here, but my thought is if you get it printed out, you can have it by comparison. So these are kind of the big three healthy diets that are recommended by most medical associations that are pretty similar. So the Mediterranean diet's on the left, the MIND diet that we've talked about. So the MIND diet is basically the distilled down scientific Mediterranean diet on the right. And then the DASH diet's in the middle. This is a plant-based diet, particularly healthy for you if you're trying to battle hypertension or high blood pressure. So, depending on exactly what you like to eat and if you have hypertension or not, you can kind of pick one of these diets to follow. But they're all pretty similar to each other.
I'll print a bigger copy of that slide for us.
Oh, great. Oh, yeah.
So when you say contraindicated, you mean like not on the.
Oh, right. Yeah. So recommended foods in the middle are recommended. Foods you shouldn't eat are at the bottom. And again, it's in moderation. Can you have birthday cake? Yes, you can. I mean, it's not that you can never eat these things. It's just try to eat a lot more of these things and less of these things. Does that make sense? Yeah. You'll notice these are all European, right? Well, I mean, Europe is tiny. The world is made up of Asia, Africa. What about those continents? They're not as well studied, at least by, American and European docs. And I'm an American doc that reads English. So, these are somewhat European centric. There's no doubt that there are many other types of healthy diets that are eaten by other folks in other parts of the world. So I tried to do a little bit of lit review in that area. So there's some really great Japanese studies as well. 3 patterns identified. So what did the Japanese researchers find? Diverse diet, eating a variety of foods was good. So, not just eating the same thing over and over. And then 2 patterns. So a high pattern, pattern 1 was high intake of beans, soybeans, vegetables, seaweed, milk and dairy. So milk and dairy they thought was actually kind of healthy in this one study. And then low level of rice actually. So rice in their study was not as good as eating this like beans and soybeans. And then high adherence to a different pattern, fish, vegetables, mushrooms, seaweed, pickles, soybeans, and green tea. I read their study, said, what do you mean by fish? Do you mean shrimp, or do you mean, one study definitely counted shellfish as fish. The other was a little bit harder to figure out. But if you're more prone to liking Asian type food, you can try to follow this kind of diet. And certainly in Seattle, we're really blessed with having a lot of Asian restaurants and things like that. So
the top is almost vegan if you didn't do no dairy or no.
Right, that's correct. Yeah, a lot of these are, yeah. Other diets. So there's people that are studying. This could be a whole 45-minute long talk. I mean, each one of these slides, I think, could be like a 45-minute long talk. But I'm trying to give you a little nuggets here. So there's ketogenic diets, which is a really high fat, very low carb diet. And kind of related to that is intermittent fasting. And the idea of intermittent fasting is when you fast, you produce ketones. Ketones get into your brain and can help accommodate a brain that can't metabolize glucose. So we use that to treat Alzheimer's potentially. And one of my former mentors has studied, I guess she's still a mentor, but yeah, she's studying a modified ketone diet specifically designed for older adults. So it's kind of a gentle ketone diet, 5 to 10% carbohydrates, quite a bit more fat, 30% protein. Small study here, 20 older adults with cognitive impairment. They did have improved cerebral spinal fluid marker profile. They had a better perfusion of their brain and some other biomarkers as well. So now they're undertaking a much bigger study at her lab at Wake Forest. Intermittent fasting is also being studied. I think long-term success in our patients is unknown. I think intermittent fasting can be tough because I think we heard earlier about routines, and in older people, if they're frail and they have other conditions, I think can be tricky, and you also don't want to get dehydrated. So I worry a little bit about intermittent fasting for an older person that has a lot of, I'm a geriatrician, as you heard, but I think if you're committed and have some help, and you're monitoring your labs and things like that. I have a couple of patients doing both intermittent fasting or ketogenic diet, and they do seem to do okay if that's what they want to do. Just really briefly, alcohol in moderation during midlife, which we learned what it was. Actually, I think it's 45 to 60. It depends on who you ask, right? Can lower the risk of heart disease and stroke. I think for persons with memory loss and people with the ApoE risk gene, alcohol is a little trickier. It is a toxin to neurons at certain doses, and I think vulnerable brains are a little more vulnerable. So probably less is more. So I wouldn't start drinking alcohol in midlife to try to protect your brain, unfortunately. Or at least limit, like wine first, like a small glass of wine. This is the Global Council on Brain Health. This is a lot of the things that we've already kind of talked about, so you can have this as a resource. It's kind of repeating some of the stuff I've already said. And then I just briefly wanted to do different stages, and then I want to leave room for questions here. So different stages. So this is kind of my 1, 2, 3 mantra. So if you're early stage, so if someone got diagnosed with early stage memory loss, or you have a risk gene or you're at risk for it, this is the time, I think, to be aggressive. Get that exercise membership, maybe try a diet. If you want to do kind of a more quote unquote extreme diet with, your doctor's approval and checking your labs and stuff, I think that's okay. But you want to pick a diet you can live with. And, if you love sweets like my mom, like cutting them out forever, it's just going to be really hard. So, picking a diet you can live with, but, and making sure you're getting enough exercise, and, working with a nutritionist or somebody to get on a ketogenic diet or get on a really strict Mediterranean diet seems like a reasonable thing to do, to just stave off all of that, as much amyloid and tau burden as possible. Nutrition consult available in your area. So naturopaths can do this, doctors, pharmacists even, lots of different resources can help you with this. I think for middle stages, so now we're talking about you're needing a little more help at home, maybe you can't drive anymore, that kind of thing. This is where I start worrying about a couple things: appetite and protein intake, swallowing issues, and staying hydrated. And so those are the things I worry about more. So there, I think, I always ask about weight loss, protein, because if you start losing muscle mass and now you're falling, that might be a bigger, you could eat healthy till the cows come home. But if you fall and break a hip, like, you didn't gain much for your overall health. So making sure you're getting enough protein and staying strong is probably better effort than, worrying about like how many blueberries for middle stages. And then for later stages, if someone's really advanced, I have some patients that come to my clinic and they're pretty advanced, and their family understandably really wants to do everything they can for their loved one. But if someone is in a pretty advanced stage, or they really are having a lot of trouble with memory, need a lot of help at home, and they're asking for ice cream, and the daughter's like, I want to get them on a Mediterranean diet. I'm like, ice cream. Let them eat the ice cream. Because at this point, the disease has advanced a lot. These diets work to prevent the tau and amyloid. There's not a lot of evidence that they'll clear it once it's caused the damage. So that's kind of why I like to think about what's the diet doing, and thinking scientifically about framing like what is, aggressive diet does help stave things off. But if you've developed, an end stage disease of any kind, whether that be lung cancer or dementia or anything, that's where I'm bringing out the ice cream. I guess I have too much of my mom in me. So, and so a comfort and goal-oriented approach, depending on the stage, I think is just appropriate for all things. is the kind of my approach. And then of course, incorporating anything else going on like diabetes and stuff. So, sorry, that was kind of a whirlwind. I hope we have time for questions. Thank you so much.
Almost 10 minutes for questions.
Yay. Oh, and there's a big chat.
Some questions from chat.
Great.
Online, and then also we can raise our hand here in the group. But
And I'll be around for lunch too,
good.
so you can come pester me.
Perfect. So a lot of time for questions. So I'm going to start with folks that are online who won't be to see very much.
Oh yeah, that'd be great.
The question was, so we kind of touched on this, but way back when you were talking about saturated fat and how it can be end up as amyloid in the brain.
Yeah.
Once amyloid is from fat is in the brain, does it stay there forever, or can diet eliminate it?
That's such a good question. And I think, you know, we're finding that out with these amyloid therapies, that we can remove amyloid with the drugs like lecanemab and aducanumab. They definitely remove amyloid from the brain. So we know that you can remove amyloid from the brain. I don't know if you know, things like diet and exercise have been shown to remove amyloid from the brain as effectively as things like lecanemab, aducanumab. I think that the preventative strategies have been more shown to either prevent amyloid and tau from forming or from helping you adapt to a disease that you have. So let's say you have Alzheimer's, but if you have social isolation and physical inactivity, that contributes to it. So I guess the short answer would be, I don't think diet removes amyloid nearly as much as we would like. I think it's more of a preventative thing. Is that, yeah. Sorry, I better answer these quicker. I gotta be less nuanced.
And then there was a question about your thoughts on low carb diets that I think you did.
Yeah.
On that.
Yeah, I think if you're going to do a very low carb diet and you have health issues and things like that, I always just recommend checking in with the doctor and just making sure you check labs and things, because they can harm your liver and kidneys if done kind of willy-nilly.
Super. And then real quick, the question, what do you think of Dr. Gundry's diet? Book, Diet Evolution, Turn Off the Genes That Are Killing You in Your Waistline. Are you familiar with Dr. Gundry?
Oh, I'm not sure. I haven't read that book. I will have to add it to my list. Thank you for the recommendation.
All right. In-person questions or others from the chat? I'm looking at the chat too. Yeah.
Oh,
I've just recently been hearing that protein becomes more important, or for seniors, they maybe don't. I'm not sure if they just need more of it or they're not using it as well. I'm not sure if that's true, but it made me wonder about either the Mind diet or Mediterranean and chicken or eggs, and I don't see either of them listed. So I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on chicken.
Oh, yes.
Or eggs as a protein source or as elements of the diet.
Yes. So the question kind of relates to protein intake. And as we get older, protein intake may need to increase to offset, I'm going to add to your question, to offset things like frailty and decreased muscle mass. But the Mediterranean and Mind diets really all kind of say a lower protein intake, and they don't have a lot of protein on here.
That's kind of what I was wondering.
Yeah, so
Used to that, they may not be getting enough of the beans or other sources.
So that's a really good question. So I think that's where you have to tailor this to your health conditions a little bit more. So if you have diabetes, this would have to be tailored. If you have frailty or kidney problems, you might not. Protein is tricky. And then if you have, like I said, middle stage of Alzheimer's, I think protein is really key. This is why I think working with a dietitian, if you're really radically changing your diet or something, I think working with a dietitian is probably the best, because they can look at your specific situation. Most Americans, I think, do pretty well with protein intake. But if you are really trying to cut out, like if you're trying to go vegan or vegetarian, it's trickier. You got to get more creative, and you also want to make sure you get all the essential amino acids too. working with a dietitian, I think, would be a really key thing to do, to make sure you're getting the right kind of protein and enough protein to not lose your muscle mass. It's a really good question. And you're right, it doesn't really say that any of that on here, or talk about any of that. It's kind of lost in the topic, isn't it?
Thank you.
Yeah, it's an evolving topic for sure. It's something I worry about with my patients.
There's another comment in chat today that if you want to comment on it too, but somebody commented vegans get higher dementia rates than in general population, according to research. And he mentions Dr. Michael Rager in the book How Not to Die.
Oh, I will have to look into that. That is a really good question, a really good comment. So I am not as aware of that. So I'm aware of like kind of blue zone diets. So people who follow kind of a blue zone diet, and they tend to be more of a vegetarian-y, not necessarily vegetarian all the time, but they tend to be more of a plant-based diet, but not necessarily vegetarian and not necessarily vegan. So I'm thinking like Okinawa, Japan, Costa Rica, Loma Linda, California. And these are just places where certain populations have congregated where they just, first and foremost, they walk a lot. Like Greece, they walk everywhere. I don't know if you remember Ruth Cohen that we had working for us. She would go to Greece and she's like, everyone walks everywhere. And like, they just walk to the store and they walk to the, mall, and they walk. And so, and then also they don't eat a lot of saturated fat and, and that kind of thing. So I think these kind of truisms hold for blue zones. But if if there's a study about like chosen vegans, like people who choose veganism within like a Western diet culture, like maybe that may be a different thing than like a whole population that kind of tends to be more vegetarian. Because I'm thinking like India, like there's a lot of really healthy diets within India. And as they adopted more of a Western diet, they're getting more diabetes and they're getting more hypertension. So I don't know what that means about switching to more of a vegetarian vegan to American Western, like as a global thing versus individuals who choose veganism. But I will have to look into that. It's all really interesting. And you can be vegan in very healthy ways, and you can be very vegan in non-healthy ways. Sort of as a total aside, you can eat fat-free foods, and here's some fat-free foods. Skittles, Smarties. Like, it just makes me laugh. When you buy, like Halloween, you read all the candies, it says fat-free. This contains no fat. It's like, yeah, until your liver gets a hold of it and converts it all to fructose and turns it into triglycerides. So, I mean, eating pure sugar will make you fat. Like, so, but it's vegan and fat-free. So FYI, there's, you know what I mean? So you have to be careful how you label stuff.
Okay, last question I have here.
I was really curious about air pollution on your list.
Oh, yeah.
And is that, I was curious about that.
Yeah, it's probably the one on here that I know the least. And the relative risk, you'll notice, is 1.1. So relative risks, the higher the number, the worse the risk. So 1 means it's not a risk. 0.9 would mean protective. 1 would be nothing. And then like 1.1 is just a blip above normal. 1.9 is like 2, it's almost twofold risk.
Mm-hmm.
So the highest risk on here is actually hearing loss, interestingly. So it's tiny, but it was real. So a lot of different people are studying it. They think maybe oxidants in the brain and that kind of thing. Over time. And there's some people, some of our colleagues at the VA study this, but I don't know too much above and beyond that. But yeah, and it's one that was added to this 2020.
Right.
And as you can see, it's
recent. And so I was curious if that came from a broader spectrum of looking at this disease on a bigger socioeconomic level. Like,
Oh, right. So, yeah, sorry. The question is, so sorry, I should be repeating the question for the Zoom audience. Just talking really quickly about the air pollution and whether that came from looking at the disease risk for a broader socioeconomic level. So absolutely. Some of these risk factors you can modify yourself to some extent. We can get into a lot of philosophy real quick, but in theory, you can control you can go and see your doctor and control your high blood pressure today, and you have some control over that. You have much less control over air pollution around you, unless you just move, right? So that's like more of a societal. Same thing with low education. You didn't ask to where you were born, what you learned. This is definitely a big epidemiology study where it's a zip code issue. Like people were born in these zip codes, they have this air pollution. So it's it's not proven. It's a theory. So, and there are some mouse studies that show that ozone can damage the brain and stuff like that. So.
The country mouse is healthier.
The country mouse might be healthier than the city mouse in air pollution. Yeah. But really interesting work. So, all right. I think we need to let you go to eat.
We gotta go. Thank you again so much.
All right.